Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, December 18th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I am glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, can a year in government spark a lifetime of innovation? Plus, service members face a simple truth with complex consequences. Follow lawful orders, refuse unlawful ones. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Office of Personnel Management wants to bring a surge of technical expertise into the government's ranks. The agency is aiming to recruit 1,000 new federal employees for the inaugural class of the U.S. Tech Force. The new hiring effort comes after hundreds of thousands of feds left government this year. Here with the details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for being here.
Hi, Terry.
So, Director Cooper has been saying he wants to bring more tech talent into the federal government. What's behind the Tech Force program?
What they're trying to accomplish here, according to OPM Director Scott Cooper, is trying to fill two separate gaps in the federal workforce that we know have existed for a long time. One is technology expertise, and then the other is early career talent. So those who are maybe just out of college or in their 20s up to maybe their early 30s. So this Tech Force program in particular is going to focus on hiring for skills in AI, software engineering, data science, and they're trying to accrue or gather talent from both the private sector and maybe those who either have skills from a college degree or otherwise. But essentially what the project here is going to do is get people hired through OPM and then have them distributed or recruited to different agencies. Like pretty much every agency has signed up for this. The State Department, Treasury Department, Defense, Interior, the list goes on and on. So there's definitely a lot of movement here, at least in the early steps here.
It seems as though every administration recently has had a tech-focused hiring initiative. What's different about this one?
So it is going to sound actually pretty familiar to a lot of past efforts, but there are a couple of differences that OPM Director Scott Cooper pointed out. So what we've seen, as you mentioned in the past, is the U.S. Digital Service, which is now called the U.S. DOGE Service, the U.S. Digital Corps from the Biden administration. There's the 18F program from the General Services Administration, the Presidential Innovation Fellowship. There's a lot of different programs where it's either a combination of trying to hire tech talent, early career talent, and all for these kind of temporary positions where employees come in for a couple of years, work on specific projects, and then maybe move on to something else. So all of those elements are going to sound very familiar for this new tech force at OPM. But the one kind of difference here is perhaps that, as OPM's Cooper says, there's going to be a lot more employees. It's a little bit larger scale, and that the employees are going to be hired directly into agencies is what he says. So he can explain a little bit more there.
What a lot of what USDS does today is they get brought in on a kind of project by project basis. These will be people who will be full-time employees assigned to the agencies, working on what the leadership believes are the most important priorities. In addition, as I mentioned, look, we're going to kind of put a whole cohort in class around this so people feel like not only are they able to get great experience working for the agencies, but also they feel like they can kind of do career development, get exposure to the private sector, and all this other stuff.
What's their timeline for getting this underway?
So they launched the program just this week, and they're looking to bring on 1,000 new hires by the end of March. That's a little bit of a fluid timeline, but that's generally what OPM is aiming for here. But they have opened the applications that are available online and on USA Jobs. And then OPM says it's going to assess candidates on a rolling basis as people apply. Once they're in, they're going to be brought in on the higher end of the general schedule. So normally GS-13 or GS-14 for most people who get hired through this. So those salaries range from about $130,000 to $190,000. So, we'll see how that all comes together by the end of March and if we're, on that timeline. But OPM's goal in the long term is also to repeat this process once per year for a new class each incoming year.
1,000 people between now and March seems pretty aggressive, and it also coincides with the time when the agencies are finalizing their workforce strategies, workforce development plans. What has OPM said about the hiring strategy to meet those goals?
So the way that they're trying to approach this is called pooled hiring effort. So OPM is essentially going to run the hiring itself and then create a list of qualified candidates from there, where agencies will be able to select and then hire whoever they want from this list that OPM has created. So OPM is going to do the assessments to create that list. They're also partnering with private sector tech companies to try to help recruit and manage to the tech force. Cooper explained a little bit more about what he's thinking with this process here.
We got to crawl before we run on this stuff, but this model, I think, is going to be hopefully a model for us to prove out how can we increase the efficiency of hiring both for the applicants and for the agency. So I'd love it if, we figure this out with the tech side of things, and then we say, great, you know what? Next time there's a ton of program manager roles or HR roles or other stuff that can benefit from centralized recruitment, that OPM has the opportunity to showcase that opportunity for both the agencies and the applicants themselves.
And what you'll notice here, Terry, too, is that idea of hiring that Director Cooper explained is going to sound very familiar, and that's because over the last several years, agencies have been doing similar types of efforts. A process called sharing certificates is something that's very common and becoming more common at agencies, where the idea is to hire for a specific type of job that's available across various agencies and be able to recruit in a more streamlined way. And then there's also been a lot of pooled hiring efforts from OPM in the past as well. For example, during the previous administration, when there was a lot of hiring under the bipartisan infrastructure law, there were pooled hiring efforts to hire HR specialists and other types of employees through those efforts as well. It's something that the Biden administration did see a lot of success in. So it seems like that's going to be a similar process repeated here, at least in terms of the way the strategy is coming together.
Director Cooper said a couple of times that this was going to be a cohort approach. So they're going to get these 1,000 folks in and treat them as a group. Do they plan to expand into additional cohorts or do similar hiring programs for other particularly critical skills?
It seems like this is something where, as he kind of mentioned in that last clip, it's going to be an effort where if it proves to be successful for the tech force here, that they're going to try to use it for other types of talent. I think he mentioned HR, maybe program managers. There are a lot of specific skills gaps that exist not at one specific agency, but across government. So it seems like that type of strategy could be particularly beneficial for those types of positions where multiple agencies are finding or having trouble hiring for them. But for the tech force itself, those 1,000 employees will just be the first iteration of the tech force, and then they'll be staying in their positions for 2 years. And as I mentioned, every year following, there's going to be a new class of the tech force each spring, it seems.
And so how do people apply?
There's a website where OPM has an open application, and you can go through USA Jobs to look at that application and get more information there.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for bringing us the story. As always, the proof will be in the pudding.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, service members face a simple truth with complex consequences. Follow lawful orders, refuse unlawful ones. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Recent comments from lawmakers have raised alarms about unlawful orders, but the real question is how service members decide what's legal. Frank Rosenblatt from the Orders Project explains the rules and the risks. Professor Rosenblatt, it's so great to have you on the show today.
Hi, Terry.
There's been a lot of talk lately, certainly from lawmakers, from senior military leaders, about the topic of lawful and unlawful orders. Describe the current situation from your perspective.
Well, military members have special license to use violence in armed conflict, but this license is not unrestrained. Otherwise, we would just have mobs working. So a professional armed force really depends on discipline, and a key ingredient of discipline is obedience. So military members have to follow orders. If you don't like what your boss says at Starbucks, then they can fire you, but they can't prosecute you. It's different in the military. There are consequences if you don't obey what your superiors tell you to do. But at the same time, this doesn't work like they tried to do at Nuremberg, where I was just following orders. We do not want or expect our military members to unthinkingly obey. So orders are presumptively lawful that they receive, but they also have a duty to disobey any orders that are manifestly unlawful.
That can be a tricky situation in execution. Describe for me or define for me what makes an order lawful or unlawful.
Well, the standard of manifestly is that an ordinary person of reasonable sense and understanding would know right away, I'm just not allowed to do this. And the classic example people think about is the My Lai massacre, when Captain Medina supposedly told his Lieutenant Calley, go clear the enemy out of there. Lieutenant Calley then did his translation of this and said, kill everyone. And the soldiers who worked for Calley should have known. But I think it's helpful to look beyond the Calley example, because I think the reality of orders is more complex. And there's a story about a dog handler at Abu Ghraib. And he was trained in the use of the military working dog, but he was told by his superiors when he worked at the prison, we need you to derogate from your training a little bit. We want you to use these dogs to help us with interrogations and to scare the prisoners. And so he thought, sure, I'll go ahead and do this because my superiors are telling him to. It's questionable whether everyone in that situation would have said, I know this is wrong. But looking years later, the military court looked and said, nope, you shouldn't have obeyed that order. It's manifestly unlawful.
So how does that differ from a personal disagreement? I don't think that's the right answer, but maybe it's lawful, maybe it's not. How does a service member decide?
Well, we do see this. Matters of conscience, religious belief, or politics are no excuse. You must follow the orders even if you don't like the president, even if you find the mission to be wrong or even distasteful. We're seeing a lot of this because, Terry, I work with an organization called the Orders Project. It's ordersproject.com. It's part of our National Institute. And we receive calls from people who have questions about their orders. And here we see this spectrum. People say, what if I'm asked to do this? Or I'm told that we're going to Chicago. What should I do? And so the National Guard deployments are very interesting because the legal status of them changes by the day. We just saw a new decision on the National Guard deployments in Los Angeles. So let's say we get a call from someone who says, I'm being told that I'm going to deploy to Chicago in a couple months. It would take a crystal ball, not legal analysis, to say that's going to be lawful or unlawful. We just don't know how the courts will decide. So in that hypothetical, we would say, you do need to plan and go on this mission unless you have an opportunity to, not re-enlist. That is something that you presumptively will have to do, even if deploying to Chicago wasn't the reason why you decided to join the military.
I'm speaking with Professor Frank Rosenblatt from the Mississippi College School of Law. He's a recognized expert in military justice, a former U.S. Army JAG officer, and president of the National Institute for Military Justice. Frank, you were talking there about a situation where a service member has some lead time between what they're being told they're going to have to do and actually having to go do it. In some of these operations, though, they're making decisions in real time. So what should folks be thinking about, if they get an order to fire and they have seconds to decide whether to do that or not?
This is really happening. And I'll tell you one scenario that people talk about that's based on reality. Let's say a senior elected official says, I want you to shoot protesters in the legs. Then you would think and know, okay, that's not lawful. But it's not as easy as that, because if you say, sir, that's unlawful, that might just pull you out of the picture and not be part of more consequential decisions. So that person does not have time to call a lawyer, and it's really a test of their own judgment and mettle. What we would not expect would be direct compliance with that order. We think maybe we could seek clarification or interpret this in a way and give guidance to subordinates that excises that illegal element. You could take that and then translate that as, we need to demonstrate our presence, we need to comply with the law. In other words, I'm saying that there are times when military members should disobey orders.
typically it's going to be a senior official who's making the decision. We don't necessarily rely on the junior operator to make this call in live action. But if they do refuse an order that later turns out to be lawful, or they execute an order that later turns out to be unlawful, what are the repercussions?
This is why it's so tricky. It's really a high-wire act that we're asking our military members to do. We are putting them in legal jeopardy when we are boundary pushing in how we do military operations. On the one hand, if you push back on something and you don't comply, and it turns out that was a lawful order, then you're going to face consequences for that disobedience. Everything from administrative sanctions to being removed from your job, possibly even a court-martial. But if you do something that you find out later is unlawful, you can also be punished for that.
So what is the role of the Orders Project in helping to clarify this really complicated conversation?
This topic obviously has received a lot of nationwide attention lately. And what that means is there are a lot of voices out there that represent different religious beliefs, political beliefs, and they're saying we want to help soldiers. Sometimes they're urging disobedience. That's not what we do. What we're trying to do is, the National Institute, we've been around since 1991. We're a collection of military law experts, and we want there to be some sort of source that is authenticated, that military members know that when I call this, I'm going to get it straight. I'm going to hear from somebody who, thumbs through the judge's bench book, the manual for courts-martial, and can actually tell me and give me sound legal advice that's actually based in military law and not based on, some other agenda.
I think we haven't heard the end of this conversation. We're going to continue to follow through on it. So are there reforms or education efforts that you would suggest that could help military service members, political appointees better understand the issues that are at stake here and make the right call from the beginning?
What I would like to emphasize is, I'm a law professor and a former judge advocate, but I actually want to de-emphasize the role of lawyers in this. I think that the issues with orders come when we ask people on the fly to do something that they haven't had the time to think through, rehearse, and train upon. I think these issues, Terry, of lawful and unlawful orders come down to if it's not a legal briefing that's going to solve everyone's questions, but when they can practice and build their expertise and competence and see where the boundaries are of their behavior. Every time our military goes to do something, whether that's operating in cities in Iraq or now in these boat strikes in the Caribbean, if we have the chance to practice this and work through contingencies, then our military members will be emboldened, they'll be more confident, they'll know exactly what their right and left limits are.
It feels like the military is being asked to push a lot of boundaries right now. Would you say, from your perspective, we've been in situations like this before? Are there lessons we can learn from the past that would help us better define the space right now?
When we think back to 9/11, for example, there was a strong demand to immediately begin military operations. And there wasn't really a lot of chance to rehearse this and to know exactly what we were doing and to integrate all of the different perspectives. But I do think what's important in this is that we have a process. At every military operational command, there are staff officers who each bring a different level of expertise. There are commanders who are trained. If we let them function, let them do their jobs, and we do this without trying to rush people or without political interference. Now, sometimes we have to respond to emergencies, and there isn't that time. But we should trust and we should have a lot of confidence in our military members and our commanders. They want to do the right thing. Let's give them the tools and the opportunity, and they won't let us down.
Where do you hope this current discussion of lawful and unlawful orders takes us? What do you hope the outcome will be?
In some sense, the temperature has been awful hot on this, and it's not really, I think, wise for this to be a political issue. And actually, if you listen to Republicans and Democrats, they're largely saying the same message about this, but they're not trusting the motives of each other. But maybe the bright side of this, the opportunity here, is the attention on this will give a greater appreciation for the difficulty that we put military members in when we rush them to do things and when we are really pushing the limits of what we have done before, whether that's boat strikes in the Caribbean or National Guard deployments in cities.
Professor Frank Rosenblatt from the Mississippi College School of Law is a recognized expert in military justice, a former U.S. Army JAG officer, and president of the National Institute for Military Justice. Thanks so much for helping us understand a little bit better this complicated issue.
Thank you, Terry, and thanks for your service.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, what reforms can fix our fragile air traffic control system? But first, can a year in government spark a lifetime of innovation? You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Noble Reach wants to make public service a stop on the career journey, not a permanent detour. Its Scholars Program places early career professionals in federal roles tackling AI, cybersecurity, and more. We'll explore how the initiative is evolving and what it means for talent mobility with Noble Reach CEO Arun Gupta. Arun, thank you so much for joining me.
Harry, thank you for having me today.
We touched base with Noble Reach back in the summer. How is the program going, and what are you learning from your first placements?
It's a great question, Terry. We've now had 2 cohorts, one that's gone through and completed the program, and one second one that we've launched. We just had the second one back for their first quarterly session after being placed. And so let me give a little bit of context. The first one was entirely federal. So they were all in federal agencies across 8 federal agencies, including Space Force, Navy, Commerce, CISA, HUD, FDA. And then the ones in our second cohort, as I talk about them, we've expanded into state and local as well. So they're across 10 states. In the first one, we had about 20. In the second one, we have about 30. So in that context, with the ones that have gone through it, the first ones, and have completed the program, I will say one can have a theory on the case about like how it can change people's lives, how it can change their perspective. It's another thing to see it in action. What we learned was the following. Look, this first cohort was there during a transition between administrations. So they started in the previous administration and obviously ended in this one. And what they found is they were welcomed by both. They actually visited the White House with both administrations. And that's a subtle but powerful thing to see, feel, and hear. That the idea of tech talent coming into government is not a political thing. It's something that we just need is what's good for the country. Second, I think what they all saw as well is that the kind of work and the types of problems that they were getting to work on were far more interesting and stimulating than when they looked at many of their peers at some of the more traditional kind of coming out of school jobs. So much so that, when we talked to them after the cohort about how many of you want to stay in public service, over 80% of them were like, they would like to continue in public service in some capacity. So what we saw with this group is, point one is that both administrations really welcomed them in the work that they were doing. Second, what they saw is the types of problems that they were getting to work on were far more interesting than what they would see with their peers that are in the more traditional jobs, so much so that 80% of them will continue wanting to stay in public service in the near term. Third, what we really saw with them as well was a sense of community. The importance of not just, I think if each one had gone into their own agency on their own, it would have been a okay experience. What made it really transformative was being part of a larger community as well, so that they can compare notes as to what's Space Force doing versus Navy, and take those learnings back into the office. And I think that's an important piece of it. Fourth, the mentorship that they got was greatly appreciated. And they talked about that. And they talked about it in the context of not only mentors that were in public service, but a lot of the mentors that we assigned them or, aligned them with had careers in both public and private. And I think that was really important, Terry, because I think they really noticed and saw that they're not making a decision for life, but these are experiences that they're having and how they can benefit them over the course of their journey. Again, a very subtle but important, I think, aspect of how we change the perception of coming into public service as not being something that you're having to commit to for 30 years, but something that can be part of the fabric of your career journey.
So you've talked to us a little bit about how the participants felt and what they learned. What kind of feedback did you get from the agencies? And can you talk a little bit more about some of the specific projects that your first and second cohorts are working on?
Yeah, look, I can give you high level the kind of work that they did. We actually do a net promoter score. And so we take it seriously to see like how are the agencies looking at what we're doing. And in that context, they were off the charts. And all the agencies came back very strong with what they really appreciated was being done with the work that was being done. But more importantly, not only with their capability, but with their attitude. And, there's an interesting anecdote of where we had a couple of people in Space Force. The problem their team was trying to address had been addressed at Navy. And the team at Space Force didn't have contacts at the Navy, believe it or not. And so, but our scholar, knew one of our scholars is at the Navy and reached out to him. And they then connected. And then, weeks later, you had those two groups collaborating on a somewhat meaningful project. And I say that because, with that, you can create a level of collaboration that is unintended benefit to what happens, right? And that's what we saw. Justin Finelli, who's over at the Navy and the CTO there, he and I just did a panel with at NDIA to their board, and we had one of our scholars there that worked with them. And the work that he was getting to do, and the fact that Justin now takes the scholar to all his AI meetings, right? Sitting down with 3-star generals and talking to them about what they're doing, to the point where other groups and agencies go like, how do I get one of them, right? And when I say one of them, it's not only again someone that's versant and capable in technology and AI, but it's also someone that has this sense of mission and purpose, and is looking to marry that with that capability and curiosity, right? And so they can ask some of the more obvious questions and that could be curious around like, how does, why do we do things this way? Which, can be very simple and very basic, but at the same time could be profound when you can say like, oh, if we used AI, we could do it this way, right? And so it's beyond even just the projects. It's inculcating a different way of thinking.
I'm speaking with Arun Gupta. He's CEO of Noble Reach. The problems that you're talking about are things that the OPM director, Scott Cooper, has himself spoken about recently, hiring more tech talent, making it easier to move between private sector and public sector and back again. How is Noble Reach in this scholar program working with OPM to really tackle some of the institutional barriers that make that mobility hard?
That's a great question. And look, we've had a lot of, been collaborating with Scott and his team, and think highly of the way that they're thinking about, the talent issue and, how we can support that. And, what we've seen is that there's an alignment around a vision that we have to change the narrative that people need to think about coming into government for, 30 years, but they can come in for 2 to 3, much like we have Teach for America, and have a profound impact, not only on them, but then on the organization as well. And so, ways that we're, collaborating and talking about things is just sharing the learnings that we've seen, because we've had the benefit now of 2 years of being out there, with programs, seeing what works for the students, like what meant, the types of mentors, even not even just having mentors, but which ones work, which ones resonate, right? What do you need to see in the agencies? You need to see that makes an experience a really meaningful one for the students. We call it the scaffolding, but what is the scaffolding? That it's not only connecting them to the job, but it's supporting them while they're there. And how do we build that community? A big lever for us here is that it's not about a transactional recruiting connection to a young professional to a job, but it's building a broader community of what we call dual citizens, public-private sector citizens, right? People that have had experience in both the public and the private sector, that can speak the language of both, that have, understand the culture of both, but then over time have networks in both. And thereby we rebuild trust because they're trusted in both areas. And so I think, those are various ways that we're collaborating with Scott, being able to identify which agencies can benefit from tech talent today, the kinds of projects that we can leverage. And I think the interesting thing is, and he's been a great partner here, is people assume that the bottleneck is getting young professionals to come in, and it's not. What we've seen in our numbers as we've been recruiting is that young professionals want to serve. They want to be doing something meaningful right now. I think, there's a lot of change taking place in society, geopolitical, technological, environmental. And, this is a group that's lived through COVID. And I think when you have that kind of change and the ground feels unsettled, you don't focus as much on yourself, but you reach out to others for stability. And I think that's what's happening. And so in that context, I think where Scott and his team can also be helpful is, helping us identify the agencies, because right now we're doing that relationship by relationship, but being able to more broadly go to agencies and saying, look, we really think this is important.
So what's next for Noble Reach? You're talking about cohorts in the numbers around 20 or 30. Do you see a massive scaling up to classes of 100 or 150? New agencies, new exposure? What's next?
Yes and yes, Terry. I think, look, our North Star has always been to scale. Our end game isn't to have 20 or 30, which is nothing wrong with that. I just think if we want to have impact, which is what we're trying to optimize on, scale is important. So, I think in this upcoming year, we're looking at hundreds, a couple hundred, and that includes federal, state, and local, and we're seeing a level of broader interest around that. Our goal is to continue to scale to multiple hundreds, get to 1,000, and really build. And because I think that's where you start to change the social narrative as well, Terry, because there's a broader objective here, and that is to start, restoring a level of respect again for going and serving in public service, as Wendy Kopp would say as well, like having students do that in the earlier part of their career has a force multiplier impact on the kinds of careers they have and the impact they have over the rest of their career. And, I think we're at that, interesting inflection point where we have the potential to shift, and we use this term internally, like shift from why to wow. And what I mean by that is rather than people asking when you go, say you're going into government to do work in AI, going like, why would you do that when you can do all these other things? They go, wow, you got selected to do that. Right. And it's that initial reaction, like by your peers, that I think starts to set a tone. And I think, with the folks that we're chatting with, partners that believe in the same thing. And, we're seeing that with governors, we're seeing that with agency heads. You see that with someone like Scott, his leadership at OPM, Michael Kratsios at OSTP, that there's a real desire to kind of like get young folks energized about this. And so that's what we're looking to do. And I think that the potential's there.
I've been speaking with Arun Gupta. He's CEO of Noble Reach. Thanks so much for the update on the program, and best of luck as you expand.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, what reforms can fix our fragile air traffic control system? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. America's air traffic system is showing cracks, and the shutdown only widened them. Chris Edwards at the Cato Institute is here to explain why budget dependence and failed modernization make the system fragile, and why he believes a Canadian-style model could be the fix. Mr. Edwards, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You have a recent article that warns about air traffic chaos, especially related to the shutdown that we saw in November. And once again, air traffic control was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. What were the key pain points that you saw?
Well, when the federal government doesn't decide on its annual budget in the appropriations process, sometimes we get a government shutdown, as most of your your listeners know. And sometimes when shutdowns happen, it affects the air traffic control system because the air traffic control system is run as part of the Department of Transportation as kind of a regular bureaucracy. And so we've seen this sorts of interruptions on air traffic control in previous shutdowns in 2013 and 2018. And the recent one where the government was shut down for a month and millions of American airline passengers were delayed and had their flights canceled.
The Department of Transportation is now offering $10,000 bonuses to air traffic controllers who had perfect attendance. Is pay the key issue here?
No, I think the problem is that the funding stream of our air traffic control system is the federal government budget. And I've written extensively about how other countries, such as Canada and the UK, have taken their air traffic control system and moved it out of the regular government budget and given it a dedicated funding stream. So in Canada, they set up a nonprofit corporation. They put their air traffic controllers in there, and it's funded separately by fees on airlines and airport landings. So the stream is insulated from political battles that may happen. Back in 2016, the House Transportation Committee here in the United States passed out a bill out of committee that would sort of set up a Canadian-style system where we'd set up a nonprofit corporate entity, we'd put the air traffic control in there, and we would fund that system separately from the regular government budget.
That sounds similar to the way Amtrak is run, and they've certainly had their funding challenges there. How would it work differently for air traffic control?
So Amtrak is still reliant on the federal government for money for capital investment. The way the Canadians and the British have set up their systems is that they are completely independently funded, and they for both the operating and the capital purposes. So the Canadian and British air traffic control systems are not subsidized. And which is the way I think it should be, because, aviation is an industry like any other. There's no reason why users shouldn't pay for the services. Air traffic control is a service, and I think that the cost should ultimately land on people who use the air traffic system.
You mentioned capital investment there. Certainly the FAA and Department of Transportation have spent, let's say, tens of billions of dollars trying to modernize the next-gen air traffic control, and they haven't been very successful yet. All of those funds would be passed on to passengers, right? Airport passengers. How would we get enough capital investment to really move forward in those critical functionalities?
So when you move the system to the private sector, like on the nonprofit system, like in Canada, the system, of course, raises money through fees, as we talked about it, but can also issue bonds to raise money for capital, just like private companies do. And that system has worked really well in Canada and Britain. In fact, both Canada and Britain, in some ways, their technology is more advanced than ours on air traffic control. You touched on the next-gen system. As some of your listeners may know, the Government Accountability Office, the Inspector General for the DOT, has been complaining about FAA's poor performance on its capital upgrades for years and years. In fact, for over 2 decades now. There's a long series of government reports criticizing the FAA for the excessive bureaucracy, the risk aversion. They're not getting the job done in terms of adding the advanced technology we need in our air traffic control system.
I'm speaking with Chris Edwards. He occupies the Kiltz Family Chair in Fiscal Studies at the Cato Institute. I want to explore a couple of other things about privatization with you, because you've also made the argument that the TSA screening function should be moved out of government funding. Talk us through that logic.
So the logic there, again, is partly that I'd like to get the politicians and their micromanagement out of some of these functions where we can. I mean, to go back to the air traffic controllers for a minute, the Washington Post had a nice story a few weeks ago about how we only have one training academy for air traffic controllers, and we have a shortage now on a lot of air traffic control facilities. This is partly because Congress hasn't allowed the creation of an additional training academy for air traffic controllers. It seems to me that's the sort of the problematic micromanagement you get when Congress tries to control these sort of functions. With airport screening, the idea is you decentralize the screening to individual airports. You have the Department of Transportation do safety oversight like they do now, but the actual screening would be controlled by airports. That would give airports more flexibility to meet the sort of individual demands and unique demands the airports face. And we wouldn't get sort of system-wide problems. We wouldn't get these system-wide mistakes. We'd get different experiences in the airports. The airports could learn from each other. The way Canada does it is they contract out their services to big expert security agencies, and many European countries do this too. The British do this, and that system works well as also.
What does the airline industry have to say about these proposals to privatize?
Well, back in 2016, the airlines, all of them except Delta, actually supported the privatization plan passed through the House Transportation Committee. So Delta was the outlier there. Most airlines were on board with privatization back then. I think that the airlines, should rethink now that we've had another government shutdown. I worry that with the budget battles in Washington are going to get bigger and nastier. Unfortunately, in coming years, because deficits and debt are going to keep growing, there's going to be a lot of pressure to cut spending. So I think we need the airlines, the Air Traffic Controllers Union and the other stakeholders need to rethink the funding for air traffic control, because I think the budget battles are going to get worse in Washington.
So if the airlines support privatization, what are the biggest political obstacles that you see that are keeping it from happening?
Well, unfortunately, in the American political system, you only sort of need, one sort of veto point, and a whole reform plan can go down. So back in 2016, the House Transportation Committee passed this reform bill through, but the Senate Transportation Committee wasn't too excited about it. Back then, President Trump in his first term supported the plan. His Transportation Secretary, Alan Chow, supported it. And the Air Traffic Controllers Union supported this privatization back in 2016 as well, because, again, they're concerned about stable funding. And they looked at the Canadian system, and they could see that it works very well. Indeed, back then in 2016, members of Congress went up to Canada, looked at the system, and so did our Air Traffic Controllers Union. They all thought it worked very well and looked good, and that was sort of the basis for that reform bill. Today, I think we've had another government shutdown that was very damaging. Millions of passengers were inconvenienced. The economy lost money from the shutdown. I think this is time, it's time now for Congress to rethink the structure of our air traffic control system.
Air traffic control is really a global industry. I mean, you get on a plane in Dallas and you fly to Frankfurt, or in Seattle and you fly to Beijing. What are our international partners in air traffic control saying about the U.S. system and how they would like it to be improved?
Well, look, the U.S. system, works well. I don't think we're at the leading edge of technology anymore, but it does work well. We have a giant system, but I worry about the future. The skies are getting more crowded all the time. Aviation demand is going up. The skies are getting more congested. Our technology is falling behind. We hear that from the GAO consistently year after year. So we're not at the crunch point yet, but I worry we've got to invest more and move that technology ahead to make progress. I mean, just to give you one example on that, the UK and Canada are moving ahead with what are called remote towers. These are, rather than the traditional towers you see at airports where you have the controllers up top looking at the airfields visually, the new idea is you put a bunch of sort of fancy technology and cameras with different sort of visual wavelengths looking at airports, and you and have the controllers looking at the runways on big screens with all kinds of advanced technology. These systems save money and they're safer. And London City Airport now has a system like this in place, and Canada's moving ahead with this as well. That's the type of technology where the FAA has been really hesitant. I think because it's a government agency, frankly, it's a little too risk averse. So I think by opening up air traffic control, we get more entrepreneurs in and more innovation. And just the last point on that is, we've seen this with NASA, or the space agency, that by opening up a little bit and letting entrepreneurs like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos get in there with new ideas, new ways of doing things, I think it's been very beneficial for America's space agency. So I'd like that same sort of innovation in air traffic control.
I've been speaking with Chris Edwards. He is occupying the Kiltz Family Chair in Fiscal Studies at the Cato Institute. Thanks so much for bringing this argument actually to our attention.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Military Family Advisory Network is conducting its biennial survey to better understand the needs of military and veteran families worldwide. The stories shared through the survey lead to real change. The research has helped shape major policy and quality of life reforms, including the Military Housing Privatization Initiative's Tenant Bill of Rights and a Congressional Quality of Life panel for service members and their families. For more detail, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Military Family Advisory Network's Chief Executive Officer, Shannon Razadin.
This is our survey that we do every other year. And it is an in-depth look at what is happening in military and veterans' families' lives. What's unique about this survey is MFAN owns the research process here, start to finish. And so what it enables us to do is dive very deeply into our findings. So we're not only understanding things at a high level, but also understanding the nuances within our findings. We know that there is not one experience that applies for all military families. There are a lot of variations based on where you're living, based on your family size, based on your rank, based on your branch. And so what we're able to do is dig into our findings in a way that gives us really concrete and actionable data so that we're not trying to boil the ocean with the solutions that we put in place. And so this research effort, it's a mixed method approach. So what does that mean? It means there's a mix of quantitative and qualitative questions. And it really gives us a clear look at what's happening in people's lives. I should also mention it's completely confidential, and it is the largest independent research effort of the military family population. So it's very important, and it is very much counted on by a variety of different stakeholders as they shape policy and programs that military families count on.
What topics does the survey cover? What kinds of questions are you asking military personnel, their spouses, and veterans?
Yeah, the survey covers a wide variety of issues in the well-being space primarily. And so there are so many different elements in our lives that touch on or can impact our well-being. So everything from finances to housing to when your last move was to family to school to childcare. But what's really intentional about this research effort is the design was done so that there's what's called branching in it. So you're not going to be asked questions about things that do not apply to your life based on what we know from how you've answered earlier questions. So for example, if you don't have kids, you're not going to get the questions on kids and education and childcare. So it's really designed in a way that is conducive to military family life. We know that people are busy, and so this is designed to be a really straightforward research effort. But it's also designed in a way that helps us, one, understand from a quantitative perspective some of the big picture things, but then the qualitative has really been powerful for us because it gives us an opportunity to hear from people in their own words about what they're going through. And we always learn things that we would have never known to ask if we were doing a strictly quantitative survey. And so this is the research effort that uncovered food insecurity in the military. This is the research effort in 2019 that uncovered the issues with military housing. And so in a lot of cases, this research effort has set the agenda as it relates to the policy and programmatic changes that need to happen so that we can make sure that military families are whole.
How does this survey compare to the 2023 version of the survey? How do they differ? Did you add any new topic areas, or are most of the questions largely the same?
There are perennial questions that we ask in every survey, and that gives us some really good longitudinal data. However, we do ask new things based on some of the things that we're seeing from the community. So, for example, we asked questions about online gambling this time. That is a new topic area. We're hearing a lot about online gambling in a variety of different conversation groups. And so we wanted to understand, are these anecdotes or is there real, data here that we need to be taking a closer look at. And so that's one example. As far as what's also new in the survey effort is for the first time ever, we've built in the methodology to allow for representative findings of our community. So what does that mean? Historically, this research effort has been able to uncover the things that the people who responded are experiencing. But we've built in the methodology now to be representative of the population. So we can speak broadly based on some control groups that we've put in place so that we can understand, this goes beyond the people who are just responding, but we can also speak with confidence from a methodologically sound perspective on representative findings. And so this is a big step for us. It was an intensive effort from a research design perspective, and we're really looking forward to releasing those findings. And we think that it will give the data even more legs than it had before.
You mentioned how you use those survey findings in different policy changes, but could you maybe highlight a couple of examples in terms of policy changes and programs that came from survey findings? Could you highlight some of the impact that the survey has had in the past?
Of course. And so when we did the research around military housing, that report became the cornerstone for privatized housing reform. It was used directly by the Senate Armed Services Committee. It led to things like the Tenant Bill of Rights and the universal lease. Again, we're not all the way there. We have a lot of work to do. Another example from an MFAN perspective is when we first uncovered the issue of food insecurity, we launched the 1 Million Meals Challenge, and we distributed 1.5 million meals in the locations where our data showed had the highest frequency of food insecurity. But then we dug deeper in a way that really MFAN's research only allows for. And we were really able to pinpoint what are the things that are happening in people's lives that lead them to food insecurity. And one of those core factors was a PCS move. And so when we looked at the data, we found that 51% of our respondents who had moved in the last 24 months were food insecure. And so that was, a red flag times a million. And also there wasn't a whole lot of support for people there. And so that was when we launched the PCS Restock program. And so now what we are doing is we're providing families in core locations with all the things that you have to replace every time you move. So think, your pantry items, but also your laundry detergent, your dishwasher detergent, your shower curtains, the shower curtain rings, all of those things we're providing people, but then we're also screening them for food insecurity. And if they're food insecure, that turns on our partnership with Instacart, and they get 3 months of groceries delivered to their home. And so that's a tangible example of how MFAN has used our data to drive really important programmatic decisions, while at the same time advocating from the policy perspective, because policy takes time, and oftentimes military families don't have that luxury. And so these things are about moving on parallel tracks with the ultimate goal of those intersecting from where programs and policies can meet.
How long is the survey going to be open for? And how are you reaching out to the military community to ensure that they know about the survey? And what message do you want military families to hear about why it's important that they participate in the survey?
We are watching our response numbers, and we'll be making a decision based on that on when to close the survey. So we don't have a specific date, but you can follow MFAN on social media, and we'll be letting you know when that last call comes. And as far as the outreach and who's participating, it's really an organic effort that we put in place. And we've been very proud because of how our network has grown and the trust that families put in us, that we see this number continue to climb. And so we ask people not only to take it, but also to share it with their network so that we can hear from as many people as possible.
That's Shannon Razadin, Military Family Advisory Network's Chief Executive Officer, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find the full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.